It was a crisp October afternoon when Jimmy Fallon decided to walk the 15 blocks from NBC Studios to his apartment instead of taking his usual car service. He needed to clear his head after a particularly intense week of shows, and the autumn air felt refreshing against his face. As he walked through the small park area near Columbus Circle, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. The sound of a violin played with such skill and emotion that it seemed to transform the busy New York street into a concert hall. Jimmy followed the music and found its source, an elderly man sitting on a worn wooden bench, his violin case open at his feet, with a modest collection of coins and dollar bills scattered inside. The musician was probably in his late 70s with silver hair that had been carefully combed and clothes that, while clearly old, had been pressed and maintained with obvious care. He wore a navy blue suit that had seen better decades and a burgundy tie that matched the autumn leaves falling around him. But what struck Jimmy most was the man's posture and technique. This wasn't someone who had learned to play violin as a hobby. This was a professional musician. A small crowd had gathered to listen, and Jimmy could see why. The man was playing a hauntingly beautiful arrangement of Memory from Cats, and his technique was flawless. The way he held the bow, the precision of his fingering, the emotional depth of his interpretation, everything spoke of decades of serious musical training and performance experience. When the song ended, the small audience applauded, and several people dropped money into the violin case. The elderly man smiled and nodded graciously, then noticed Jimmy standing at the edge of the crowd. "Any requests?" the man asked the gathered listeners, his voice carrying a slight tremor of age, but also the confidence of someone accustomed to performing. "Do you know anything from Phantom of the Opera?" a young woman called out. "Of course," the man replied with a warm smile. "One of Andrew Lloyd Webber's finest." He lifted his violin and began playing Think of Me, and Jimmy felt goosebumps rise on his arms. This wasn't just good street performance, this was Broadway quality musicianship. After the song, the crowd began to disperse, but Jimmy remained. When the last listener had walked away, Jimmy approached the bench. "That was absolutely beautiful," Jimmy said. "You're incredibly talented." The man looked up with surprise and immediate recognition. "Oh my goodness, you're Jimmy Fallon, Mr. Fallon. What a pleasure to meet you. I'm George Castellano." "George, that performance was amazing. Are you a professional musician?" George's expression grew complicated, carrying pride mixed with something that looked like loss. "I was once upon a time. I spent 43 years as a musical director on Broadway, worked on revivals of classics like Oklahoma, South Pacific, and My Fair Lady. Also did some original productions that didn't run as long as we'd hoped." Jimmy sat down on the bench next to George, genuinely fascinated. 43 years on Broadway, that's incredible. What shows did you work on?" "Oh, quite a few. I was assistant musical director for the 1980 revival of West Side Story, musical director for several touring productions, and I spent the last 15 years of my career working on various productions at smaller theaters. Nothing as grand as Phantom or Lion King, but meaningful work nonetheless." "So what brings you to playing in the park?" Jimmy asked gently, sensing there was more to the story. George's face grew solemn. "Well, my wife Margaret passed away 2 years ago. She had been sick for quite some time, and the medical bills, they consume most of our savings. My pension covers the rent on our little apartment in Queens, but not much else. And honestly, Mr. Fallon, sitting alone in that apartment all day was killing my spirit." Jimmy felt his heart constrict. "George, I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Margaret was my partner in every sense. She was a choreographer, actually. We met working on a production of Carousel in 1967. 47 years of marriage, and every day was better because of her." George looked down at his violin, running his fingers along its worn surface. After she died, I didn't touch this instrument for 6 months. But then I realized that music was all I had left of our life together. So I started coming out here playing the songs we loved, keeping that part of our world alive. And the money helps with expenses? It does, George admitted without embarrassment. I'm not proud of needing it, but I'm not ashamed either. I've worked my entire life and I'm still working, just in a different venue than I'm used to. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, processing the profound dignity with which George was handling his circumstances. George, do you miss Broadway? Every single day, George said immediately. I miss the energy of opening nights, the collaboration with other artists, the feeling of helping to create something magical for an audience. But mostly, I miss feeling like my experience and skills were valued. What do you mean? George sighed. The theater world changed a lot in my final years. Everything became about youth and technology. Younger musical directors with digital expertise were preferred over old-fashioned musicians like me who learned on acoustic instruments. I was often told my approach was outdated, even though the fundamentals of music haven't changed. Jimmy looked at George's violin case, which he now noticed had several business cards and flyers taped inside the lid. What are those? Oh, those are from music students and small theater groups who've heard me play here. Sometimes I get asked to give violin lessons or help with local productions. It's not much, but it keeps me connected to music in some way. George, would you play something else for me? Something that was special to you and Margaret? George's eyes brightened. She always loved Somewhere from West Side Story. We actually met during a rehearsal of that song. She was choreographing the dance break, and I was conducting the orchestra. George raised his violin and began to play, and Jimmy watched as the elderly man was transformed by the music. His posture straightened, his movements became more fluid, and his entire being seemed to radiate the joy and skill of a lifetime spent in service to beautiful music. When the song ended, Jimmy knew he had to do something. George, what would you say if I told you I wanted to invite you to be on The Tonight Show? George stared at Jimmy in disbelief. Are you serious? Completely serious. George, you're an extraordinary musician with an incredible story. I think our audience would be moved and inspired by meeting you. Mr. Fallon, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure what I could possibly contribute to your show. I'm just an old musician who plays in the park. George, you're not just anything. You're a keeper of musical tradition, someone who has dedicated his life to bringing beauty into the world. That's exactly what our show needs more of. Jimmy stood up and pulled out his phone. Can I get your contact information? I'd like to have my producers reach out to you about appearing on the show. George provided his information with shaking hands, still unable to quite believe what was happening. Mr. Fallon, why would you want to help me? Because, George, talent like yours shouldn't be hidden on street corners. And because I think there are probably a lot of people like you, experienced artists who are struggling to find their place in a world that's always looking for the next new thing, instead of appreciating the wisdom and skill of the previous generation. 3 days later, George Castellano walked into Studio 6B wearing the same navy suit he'd worn in the park, but this time it had been dry cleaned, and he wore a new tie that Jimmy's production team had purchased for him. He carried his violin case with the same care he might handle a priceless artifact. Jimmy introduced George to his audience with genuine warmth and respect. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet someone very special. A few days ago, I was walking through Columbus Circle when I heard the most beautiful violin music. It was coming from George Castellano, a man who spent 43 years as a musical director on Broadway, and is now sharing his incredible talent with anyone lucky enough to walk by and listen. George took the stage with a combination of nervousness and natural stage presence that spoke to his years of professional performance experience. "George," Jimmy said once they were both seated, "tell our audience about your career on Broadway." George spoke eloquently about his decades in theater, the shows he'd worked on, the artists he'd collaborated with, and the profound satisfaction of helping to create live musical theater. The studio audience was clearly captivated by his stories and the obvious depth of his experience. "And now you're performing in parks?" Jimmy asked. "Yes, and it's been quite wonderful, actually," George said with surprising positivity. "I have met people I never would have encountered in traditional theater venues. Children who had never heard live classical music, business people who stopped their rushing to listen to a song, tourists who wanted to know about American musical theater. In some ways, I'm reaching a broader audience now than I ever did on Broadway." Jimmy could see that George had found a way to reframe his circumstances as an opportunity rather than a defeat, and he admired the man's resilience. "George, would you play something for us tonight?" "I'd be honored to, Mr. Fallon." George stood up and raised his violin. "I'd like to play Somewhere from West Side Story, which was special to my late wife, Margaret, and me." As George began to play, something magical happened in Studio 6B. The audience fell completely silent, absorbed in the beauty of the music and the skill of the musician. But Jimmy could see that this was more than just a performance for George. This was a connection to his life's work, to his marriage, to everything that had given his life meaning. When the song ended, the studio erupted in a standing ovation that lasted almost 2 minutes. George stood on the Tonight Show stage with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the response. But Jimmy wasn't finished. "George, I have a surprise for you. I'd like you to meet some friends of mine." The Roots, who had been watching from their usual spot, walked over to where George stood. Questlove approached with a huge smile. "Mr. Castellano, we've been talking backstage and we'd love to play something with you. Would you be up for that?" George looked stunned. "You want to play with me?" "We've been looking for ways to incorporate more classical elements into our sound," Questlove explained. "And after hearing you play, we think you could help us bridge that gap between classical and contemporary music." What followed was an impromptu collaboration between George and the Roots, a fusion of classical violin with contemporary rhythm that created something entirely new and beautiful. George's traditional training combined with the Roots' innovative approach to create music that honored both past and present. After the show, Jimmy spent time talking with George about his situation and his future. "George, I want to help you in a more concrete way. What would you say to the idea of starting a program that connects veteran artists like yourself with opportunities to perform and teach?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are probably dozens of artists like you in New York alone, people with incredible skills and experience who have been pushed aside by an industry obsession with youth. What if we created a platform for those artists to share their knowledge and continue performing?" Jimmy's idea evolved into what became known as the Encore Artists program. The Tonight Show partnered with music schools, community centers, and small theater companies to create opportunities for older professional artists to teach, perform, and collaborate with younger musicians. George became the program's first artist in residence, teaching violin at a community music school in Queens, while also performing regularly at small venues around New York. His story inspired other veteran artists to come forward, and soon the program was connecting retired Broadway musicians, dancers, and actors with students and audiences eager to learn from their experience. "You know what's interesting," George told Jimmy 6 months later, when he returned to the show to perform with a youth orchestra he had been training. "I thought my career was over when I started playing in the park, but it turns out it was just beginning a new chapter. The youth orchestra, made up of students from the community music school where George taught, performed a medley of Broadway classics arranged by George himself. Watching these young musicians perform under George's direction, Jimmy could see the profound impact that intergenerational artistic collaboration could have. "George, you've created something beautiful here," Jimmy said as they watched the young violinists pack up their instruments after the performance. "We've created something beautiful," George corrected. "These kids have taught me as much as I've taught them. They've shown me new ways to interpret classical music, and I've helped them understand the emotional depth that comes from years of experience with these compositions." The Encore Artists program continued to grow, eventually expanding to other cities and connecting hundreds of veteran artists with new opportunities to share their expertise. George's story had sparked a national conversation about ageism in the arts and the value of experience in creative fields. But for George personally, the most meaningful change was simpler. He was no longer playing alone on a park bench, hoping that passers-by might appreciate his music. He was part of a community again, collaborating with other musicians, teaching students who valued his knowledge, and performing for audiences who understood and appreciated his artistry. "Margaret would have loved this," George told Jimmy during one of his regular visits to the show. "She always believed that art was about connection between performer and audience, between tradition and innovation, between the wisdom of experience and the energy of youth." Jimmy kept George's business card from that first day in the park, now framed in his office as a reminder that talent and artistry don't diminish with age. They deepen and mature, offering perspectives and insights that can only come from a lifetime of dedication to craft. The violin case that had sat open on the park bench, collecting coins from generous strangers, now sat in George's apartment filled with letters from students, invitations to perform, and sheet music for new arrangements he was working on. But George never forgot those months in the park, when music was all he had left and all he needed to keep going. "Playing in that park taught me something important," George reflected during a later interview. "Music doesn't need a grand theater or a famous audience to be meaningful. Music just needs someone willing to play it with love and skill, and someone willing to stop and listen. Everything else, the venues, the recognition, the career success, that's all wonderful when you have it, but it's not what makes music matter." The last performance had become the first performance of an entirely new chapter, proving that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a different, and perhaps even more meaningful one. It wasn't just late-night television. It was a reminder that artistry is not a young person's privilege, but a lifetime commitment, and that sometimes the most profound performances happen not when we're at the height of fame and success, but when we're stripped down to nothing but our love for our craft and our willingness to share it with whoever will listen.